Good to see you back for the second part of my conversation with Nathanael Noiraud, looking closely at the FDI market in the Asian Pacific region. He's going to disclose to us what you as a potential investor should be looking out for.
Well, I think it's really about understanding as much as you can, the market and the specific country in which you want to invest. Having very good, reliable partners on the ground, and precisely the long-term approach, which is very, very much Asian also in nature.
And the labor force. I mean, you mentioned now a couple of times working closely together with the government. I guess it's both ways. They're listening to you, what are investors looking for, and they are potentially adjusting,
yes.
Facilitating. But what about the labor force? Because if I look at the ease of doing business, of course, how easy you can hire and fire, but is one thing. But what is really interesting here, if the government says yes, but you have to have a certain amount of local people working for your, let's say, tech company. Is that feasible? Are they educated?
Yeah, of course, it's largely feasible, and it's even, again, business-wise in your interest to do so, because you need to have local people who truly understand the market. Culturally speaking, it takes a while to really understand what's going on around you. I remember myself 10 years ago arriving in Asia with some notions from my studies and a few travels, but doesn't make you knowledgeable about it, the culture and how to understand what is a yes, what is a no, what is a yes, no, etc. And so this is where you really need to have local workforce. In terms of education and training, there is also a strong progress, and that's really, it is visible in a number of countries. So, of course, some countries are progressing faster than others, but at least the dynamic is toward a better education level, which is very positive. And then, depending on what you need to do, you can also keep in mind that in certain countries, you have the capacity to bring foreign talents from the ASEAN region into a hub. So that's what we tend to do, for instance, in Kuala Lumpur or in Singapore. Because you will find a lot of people in Indonesia, in the Philippines, in Thailand, Vietnam, etc., would be quite excited actually to move to KL or look at it. It's like if you are, in Eastern Europe and you have a job offer in London or Zurich, it can be super exciting, right? It's a different life. You will own more than in your home country, etc. So that's also a way we use to be very relevant. And to have talented people from the local country, of course, and that's sometimes a requirement from the country who gives the incentive. It's, of course, a give and take, but also to attract talents from the region.
And that's a really crucial point you're mentioning there, the talents from the region. And, I've been to quite a few holiday destinations looking at big constructions. And, you ask around because you're curious about the culture. So what's going on here? Who is investing? Who is building this, let's say, new hotel or shopping mall? And often it was the Chinese companies. And I'm not going to be specific here simply because this is really just hearsay in my personal experience. So there's no statistics behind it. But you read it in the papers as well. If you have Chinese investors, what they sometimes, if not often, tend to do is send their Chinese people there. So locally speaking, like in Africa, for example, also in the Caribbean, locally speaking, you see this big construction site, and then you see a lot of Chinese as construction workers, and you do not see the locals doing that. Is that an issue? Is that something that, the destination of that FDI really profits from and has their own local economies and people get richer through this FDI investment?
So, to be honest, as of today, if you look at the salary in China, even for construction workers, it's not necessarily the cheapest workforce. And that's why in Asia, you will rarely see projects, even if they are led by Chinese companies. You will not see that often those entities hiring and bringing in Chinese workers because they actually find more economic solutions with people from Bangladesh, for instance, or people from Nepal, etc. So that may drive some concerns around some security issues, etc. But we don't need to get into the details here. But yeah, the idea of bringing over the full staff, I think, is something that, as you mentioned, you will more observe in Africa, maybe. But in Southeast Asia, the approach usually, and it's not only for Chinese construction companies, but you see a lot of workers coming from Bangladesh, coming from Nepal, and other countries of Asia itself with lower labor costs. And so a lot of this money will be sent back to the family, like in Latin America, las remesas for the Cuban workers or workers from Central America working in the US, sending back money to their family. So you have similar modus operandi here.
Let me quickly interrupt the conversation to say thank you that you are here with me on the channel. If you do enjoy what I'm putting out, the in-depth kind of conversations, then why don't you subscribe and also hit the bell button so I can keep you informed with our newest releases. Thanks for that in advance, and let's get back to the conversation. When it comes to incorporating your company in Asia as a European company, for example, I mean, we've been going through it with our partnership as well, looking at different hubs across the world where it's potentially beneficial. Singapore pops up all the time where you go like, okay, this is a market I'm going to be active in anyway. What are the other countries that are really starting to model what Singapore has to offer and at what speed?
Yeah, so I think Kuala Lumpur has been, and Malaysia has been, and is still a very interesting alternative to Singapore, or rather than an alternative, I would say something that can complement Singapore, for the reason that in terms of cost efficiency, for certain things and for certain talents, you will find pretty much equivalent quality of service or workforce, or even sometimes better, for twice or three times cheaper than in Singapore. So that is extremely interesting, of course. And you also have this heritage of the common law, which makes the business law very easily understandable and quite safe for foreign investors in most sectors. Okay, so Malaysia is a very strong option. Thailand is attracting a lot of people as well, and it's also about the culture and the lifestyle. In terms of navigating the law, it's not as easy because most documents, if not all, will still be in Thai, and not many foreign investors can understand and read Thai. So we mentioned that Vietnam is modernizing a lot and at a very high speed. So yeah, those countries would probably be the top one. But you see also I was having an update on the Philippines recently. They have created also a new kind of status for foreign entrepreneurs, which didn't exist a few years back. But still, in terms of timeline, it's not yet as quick as what you can get in Singapore or in Malaysia.
So whilst there are a lot of opportunities in the developing countries, there's still a lot to do. However, the dynamics are definitely there. So looking at Asia, Europe, and the US, where do you expect the most money is going to flow over the next 5 to 10 years, Nathanael?
So I think in Asia still, and the main difference will be that a high percentage of this money will come from Asia itself. And this is a trend that I think you were mentioning earlier. So this is really my strongest expectation for the coming years.
And what does that leave the European investors and the American investors with? Are we also going to continue to do FDI in Asia, or looking at that intra-Asian trend of FDI, go like, okay, we need to bulk up our own economies? Is that something that you would think is understandable, smart, or will not feature?
I think it really depends on the sector of economy you are active in. You definitely, as a European or American investor, want to keep an eye on what's happening in Asia. But you need, again, to have extremely reliable information and reliable partners on the ground to know what can be done in a realistic approach. And as far as keeping sovereignty on our economies, etc., I think for Europe we have a lot of things to fix about our own societies.
Yes,
probably. I think the coming decade is calling for higher level of humility, probably from the European side.
Yep.
And to see how we can improve on many aspects, whether it's the efficiency about the way that, we give opportunity within our societies, and also in the way that we are not becoming completely dependent upon production happening, all of it happening everywhere else. So I think this is another challenge for Europe, and to a certain extent, the US will face similar challenge, because at some point, the monetary domination will not be sufficient to sustain leadership. So this is also a strategic issue, I guess.
Yeah, and I'm happy that you mentioned that. It is really what your objective ultimately is long term. And I get the sense that Asia, the ASEAN, contracts that have also, just had quite a bit of development over the last few months, they are doing everything to become the number one in terms of economic activity, millionaires being churned out on a daily basis, and billionaires as well. So the richness is this clear focus, it seems, in this area. Whereas, as you just mentioned it, Nathanael, here in Europe, people argue about sovereignty, about, international kind of little cockfights or ego fights, rather than looking at the big picture and say, okay, how do we position ourselves as, recipients of incredible talent, of FDI, of, being just easier in terms of tax facilitation as well, in order to attract money. And then the US, well, the verdict is still out there, and now Biden has taken over. What really the dynamic or the common goal of America in the global context is going to be?
Yeah, no, exactly. And I think, it's very important, again, like to keep a close eye on Asia and to have already started to tie partnerships with some Asian countries, which is something we observe in Asia. But, just a few figures in terms of import and export balance between ASEAN and Europe. When you look at the figures, you realize that the exchanges between China and ASEAN or Japan and ASEAN are actually more important than all of the EU combined and ASEAN. So there is still a lot to do here, because it's not like we have nothing to exchange or to work on, but it's more about having more interpenetrated economies. And
so you do have a big job on your hand, because this is what you're trying to do. You get us European investors, let's say, to get over there and calm them down. And we touched on it a couple of times, and that is the cultural difference, as you were mentioning. Yes, a local labor force potentially being the best idea, but what about the bosses? Because you said on one hand, you need to keep a close eye on whatever the operation in Asia is doing. And of course, the temptation is whoever knows your company best here should also be the delegate over there. But that's not necessarily a good thing, is it?
Well, it's really a matter of people. So, from our experience, we've had mostly great experiences. And of course, it takes a bit of time, because you also make mistakes sometimes in appointing the director for specific operations. But for us, it's a combination. Sometimes the directors of operations are local, sometimes they are foreigners, but in most cases, if they are foreigners, they have been there for quite some time. Like we have people in the team who have been in Asia for 40 years, lived all across, all over Asia. So that gives a lot of perspective on things, and that helps, of course, to avoid the common mistakes.
Yeah, and it makes me think of, one of the stories my husband tells me when he was still working for GE. He went to Japan to sort out GE in Japan. He was there for 4 years. And the bottom line was it took him at least 6 months, if not longer, to understand the culture, to understand how how Japanese workers or teammates want to be talked to, delegated to, all the etiquette, and this cultural sensitivity is so key and often underestimated by big brands. The big top 100 companies going like, okay, we are coming as if still in colonial times, and we just take over, and it's not easy.
No, it's absolutely true. And from my experience, it was the same. The first 6 months, I usually say I did not understand much. And so
never mind the language, just okay, what's the body language all about?
Exactly. But after that, you start understanding a bit, and then more, and then you progress. But you can never think that you really understood all of it, because it's extremely far from you still. When I was in my younger years of living abroad, I started with Central America, South America, then I studied in the US. So of course, very different from where I grew up in France and in Europe in general. Yet pretty quick to understand most behaviors, the way the societies are shaped. Also, the religious factor is important, and many other aspects of life. After a few months, you really start to understand, whether you talk about Latin America or North America. It's not so far, right? But as far as Asia is concerned, it's really another world, right? And even after 10 years, there are still things that surprise me, which is great. You need to be surprised in life also.
No, absolutely, to have fun. And it's great that you still continue to discover, meaning that you're learning. You're still curious about, a culture that you've been introduced to. And there is not just one culture. I mean, I'm exactly saying that because we have the French culture, we have the Italian culture, the German culture, the Swiss culture, whatever. The same thing, of course, in the Asian Pacific region. Which brings me to another thing, and that is the image. COVID-19, we haven't really touched on it, but we are more than a year into the pandemic. Vaccines are out. But to what extent does, let's say, in China, the image of China really make investors go there or not? Let's say the image of previously the copycats of the world and, stealing information from something that is actually IP protected in your company, to being a hub of, causing or where SARS and also COVID-19 started. Is it on investors' minds at all? Or is that something that, whatever, as long as you actually make a profit and you can expand and scale up your business in that region, that's all that counts?
Yeah, I think, again, it's really dependent upon which sector of the economy you're in and what is the level of exposure to the public eye of your overseas, of your investment overseas. But I think the bigger picture here is whether China still needs any form of foreign investment. And the answer is not much. Because the speed at which they have moved forward over the past decades is just unprecedented. And in many aspects of the economy, I don't think they are really in demand of any form of investments, right?
Oh, yeah. It makes me laugh. A conversation I had the other day where it was about a technological bit. And somebody said to me, yeah, but it's Chinese. And I said to him, yeah, because it's Chinese, I like it. And I think there the image is starting, and the quality also of the product is really starting to change. At least for me, it has. And also the entire endorsement of whatever is in deep tech, technology, blockchain, etc., very much convinces me that this hub is so many strides ahead. Definitely when it comes to Europe. Don't know about America too much.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's true. I mean, and the dynamic of moving away from China, all the low value-added production. And I remember I was, in another life, I was in the optical industry, traveling the world, visiting factories in China and everywhere. And I saw this activity being moved to northern Vietnam, for instance. So anything that was considered not enough high-tech, starting 2010, China actually moved it away. So there was a real strong political willingness to move up the ladder in terms of innovation and high tech.
Nathanael, in order to wrap up our conversation, what would you say to potential, investors, people that are interested in going and really putting their money into the APAC region? What are the 3 key things you would advise them to look at, to consider, and to do?
Well, I think it's really about understanding as much as you can, the market and the specific country in which you want to invest. Having very good, reliable partners on the ground, eyes and ears on the ground who can help you in the long term, and precisely the long-term approach, which is very, very much Asian also in nature, to look at the long term, because maybe there will be some fluctuations, which might be a little bit more extreme than what you're used to in Europe or in the US. But in the long term, if you've made a sound decision, you cannot lose.
Yeah, and if I think about, the region in general, the ASEAN region really being the fourth biggest economic bloc in the world in, 9 years' time, that is amazing considering how it was only 20 years ago. Nathanael, thank you so much for having spent some time with us here on Mentory TV, giving the insight and the incredible great job you actually do with your company in terms of clarity, in terms of showing investors opportunities in the APEC region and facilitating it as well as co-investing. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Patricia. It was a pleasure.
And thank you, my dear Mentory TV community, to have joined us yet again for a conversation, this time with Nathanael Noiraud, where we dug deep into the FDI activities, especially in Asia Pacific, and technology seems to be top notch. Also, what Nathanael had to say was, look at Malaysia, look at Thailand, Singapore, yes, is going to very much set the tone of where your opportunities lie in future. So thanks again for joining, and I see you next time here on Mentory TV.